The old man's trembling hands pressed against the ornate mirror frame as he spoke his final words to the young notary. "Never let them remove the mirrors," Victor Hendricks wheezed, his reflection multiplying infinitely in the countless looking glasses that lined every wall of his Schiedam mansion. "They are not decorations. They are containers." The notary shifted uncomfortably, his own image fracturing across dozens of surfaces, creating an army of nervous clerks in cheap suits. Victor's collection was legendary in the small Dutch city. Over 300 mirrors of every shape, size, and era imaginable. Venetian glass from the 16th century hung beside modern industrial pieces, their surfaces creating a labyrinth of reflections that made the house feel simultaneously infinite and claustrophobic. "Sir, perhaps we should focus on the legal matters," the notary suggested. But Victor's grip tightened on his arm with surprising strength for a dying man. "You don't understand," Victor hissed, his eyes wide with an intensity that made his reflection seem to burn in the surrounding mirrors. "I've spent 40 years collecting them, not for their beauty, for what they hold. The souls, they get trapped, you see, caught between the silver and the glass. And now," he coughed, a wet, rattling sound, "now they're all so very hungry." The notary would later tell police that at that moment, every mirror in the room seemed to shimmer simultaneously, as if something was moving just beneath their surfaces. Victor Hendricks died 3 hours later, alone except for his countless reflections. 2 weeks after the funeral, the house stood empty and silent on Lange Haven Street. The municipality of Schiedam had sealed it pending the resolution of Victor's estate. He had no living relatives, and his will contained only cryptic instructions about maintaining the collection's integrity and never breaking the circles. Mayor Elizabeth van der Berg walked through the rooms with the city planning committee, her footsteps echoing strangely in the mirror-lined corridors. Every surface reflected their small group into a crowd of officials, creating the unsettling illusion of being watched by dozens of strangers. "We could turn it into a museum," suggested Councilman Peters, though his voice lacked conviction. "The mirror collection is quite valuable, historically speaking." Elizabeth paused before a massive Baroque mirror, its golden frame carved with cherubic faces that seemed to leer in the dim afternoon light filtering through heavy curtains. Her reflection looked haggard, older than her 45 years. "Have you noticed," she said quietly, "how none of the mirrors reflect the same lighting? Look closely." The committee members gathered around her, studying their reflections. Peters was right. In some mirrors, the light seemed brighter, almost golden. In others, shadows fell at impossible angles. One small hand mirror near the floor reflected what appeared to be candlelight, though no candles burned in the room. "Trick of the glass," Peters muttered, but he stepped away from the mirrors as he spoke. "Old silvering techniques create distortions." Elizabeth didn't respond. She was staring at her reflection in the Baroque mirror, where for just a moment She could have sworn she saw someone standing behind her, a tall, thin figure that wasn't present when she turned around. The house was sealed the next day with municipal boards and warning signs. But the mirrors remained inside, waiting in the darkness. 3 months later, Jack Morrison and his girlfriend Emma found themselves standing outside the boarded house on a dare. 22-year-old university students from Rotterdam. They'd heard the stories circulating in local bars, tales of the crazy old collector and his haunted mirrors. "This is stupid," Emma whispered, pulling her jacket tighter against the October chill. The house loomed before them, its windows covered with municipal boarding that had already begun to sag and warp. Someone had spray painted SPIGLS equals Hades across one of the boards, Dutch graffiti warning that mirrors equaled hell. Jack pried at a loose board covering a basement window. "Come on, it'll be fun. Just a quick look around, maybe take some photos for Instagram." Urban exploration is huge right now. The board came away easier than expected, revealing a grimy window that reflected their phone flashlights back at them like accusatory eyes. Jack squeezed through first, landing with a soft thud on the basement floor below. "Jesus," he breathed as Emma dropped down beside him. Even the basement was lined with mirrors, dozens of them, ranging from pocket-sized compacts to massive shop displays, created an impossible geometry of reflections. Their phone lights multiplied into a constellation of stars, each beam bouncing endlessly between the surfaces until the small basement seemed to stretch into infinity. "We shouldn't be here," Emma said, but her voice held more awe than fear. The effect was mesmerizing, like standing inside a kaleidoscope. Jack turned from the antique mirror he'd been examining, following Emma's gaze to the vine-framed looking glass. At first, he saw only their normal reflections, Emma standing rigid with fear, himself turned sideways with confusion written across his face. "I don't see anything," he said, but as the words left his mouth, his reflection in the mirror seemed to lag behind his actual movement. When he raised his hand to gesture, the reflection took a split second longer to mirror the action. "Look at the corners," Emma whispered. In the reflection, the dark corners, Jack stared harder and gradually became aware of what Emma had seen. The reflected room was wrong, not just in its dimensions, but in its occupancy. Shadows fell differently. The draped mirrors appeared to have different shapes beneath their coverings. And in the far corner of the reflection, barely visible in the darkness, stood a figure. It was tall and impossibly thin, dressed in what appeared to be formal clothing from another era. Its face was obscured by shadow, but its posture suggested it was watching them. When Jack shifted his position, trying to get a better view, the figure in the reflection moved as well, but not in the same direction. "We need to leave now," Emma said, backing away from the mirror. But Jack was fascinated. He approached the glass, studying the figure more closely. "It's probably just a trick of the light," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Or maybe it's a reflection from another mirror, creating an optical illusion. As he drew closer to the surface, the figure in the reflection became clearer. It was definitely a man gaunt, with hollow cheeks and deep-set eyes that seemed to track Jack's movement. The man's mouth was moving, as if he was trying to speak, but no sound penetrated the glass. Suddenly, Emma screamed. Emma couldn't sleep for 3 days after their escape from the mirror house. Every reflective surface, bathroom mirrors, shop windows, even the black screen of her laptop, seemed to hold the potential for unwanted visitors. Jack tried to convince her it had been mass hysteria, shared delusions brought on by the spooky atmosphere and local legends. But Emma needed answers. She spent hours in the Rotterdam City Library, digging through newspaper archives and historical records about Victor Hendricks and his collection. What she found made her stomach turn with a cold, spreading dread. Victor hadn't just collected mirrors, he'd collected mirrors with histories. Dark histories. The first article she found was from 1987. Local collector purchases mirror from demolished psychiatric hospital. The accompanying photo showed a younger Victor standing beside a large institutional mirror that had hung in the ward for violent patients at a mental hospital in Amsterdam. The hospital had been shut down after a series of unexplained suicides, many of which occurred in rooms with that particular mirror. Another clipping from 1991 described Victor's acquisition of mirrors from an estate sale following the murder-suicide of an entire family in Den Haag. The journalist noted that Victor seemed specifically interested in the bedroom mirrors where the bodies had been found. The pattern became clear as Emma read through decades of purchases. Victor sought out mirrors that had witnessed trauma, mirrors from crime scenes, accident sites, places where people had died in fear or anguish. But the most chilling discovery was a handwritten journal she found in the library's local history section, donated by Victor himself just months before his death. In it, he detailed his theory about mirrors and souls. A month after Emma's research, 5 members of Rotterdam's homeless community discovered the loose basement window that Jack and Emma had left unsecured. Desperate for shelter as winter approached, they saw the abandoned house as a perfect refuge from the cold streets. Martin, the unofficial leader of their small group, was a former construction worker whose life had unraveled after a workplace accident left him unable to work. With him were Petra, a middle-aged woman with untreated mental illness, young Tom, barely 19 and fresh from aging out of the foster system, elderly France, whose pension couldn't cover Rotterdam's rising rent costs, and Sarah, a university dropout struggling with addiction. They entered through the basement, just as Jack and Emma had, but their reaction to the mirrors was different. To people who had spent months avoiding their own reflections in shop windows and public restrooms, reminders of how far they'd fallen. The house's mirrors felt almost welcoming. "It's like a funhouse," Tom laughed, watching his image multiply infinitely in the basement's reflecting surfaces. "Look, there's 100 of me." They made camp in the main parlor, pushing aside the sheet-covered mirrors to create space for their sleeping bags. Martin found candles in the kitchen and lit them throughout the room, creating a warm, flickering ambience that made the mirrors dance with golden light. "Not bad," Petra said, settling down against her backpack, Beats sleeping under the bridge. But as night fell and the candles burned lower, the mirrors began to change. Sarah was the first to notice it, a movement in her peripheral vision, caught in one of the larger mirrors across the room. Tom was the first to fully succumb. On their third night in the house, he began speaking to the mirrors as if they contained old friends. Martin watched with growing concern as the young man carried on animated conversations with his reflection, responding to questions only he could hear. "They're telling me about the house," Tom explained when Martin asked about his behavior. "The people who lived here before us, they want to help." "Tom, there's no one there," Martin said gently. But Tom just smiled with the patient expression of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "Not in the room with us, no, but they're there." He pointed to an ornate mirror hanging near the fireplace. "Victoria is in that one. She died in 1892, fell downstairs in her own home. The mirror was in her bedroom when it happened." Martin looked at the mirror Tom indicated. He saw only their normal reflections, but as he watched, Tom's reflection began to move independently. While the real Tom stood still, his reflected image walked closer to the mirror and pressed its palms against the glass from inside. "Jesus Christ," Martin breathed, stepping backward. Tom laughed. "See, you're starting to understand. They're not trapped, Martin. They're waiting. And now they're ready to come back." That night, Martin woke to find Tom standing naked before the largest mirror in the room. A massive piece of black glass in an ebony frame that reached nearly to the ceiling. Tom's hands were pressed flat against the mirror's surface, and he was whispering urgently to his reflection. But it wasn't his reflection anymore. By dawn, Tom had not moved from his position before the black mirror. His body remained cold and motionless, while his lips continued their urgent whispers to the figure in the glass. Martin and France had managed to pull Sarah and Petra to the kitchen, the only room in the house without mirrors. But both women were catatonic, staring at nothing with expressions of absolute terror. "We need to call someone," Martin said, though his phone had long since been disconnected for non-payment. "Police, ambulance, someone." France shook his head grimly. "And tell them what? That mirrors are possessing people. They'll think we're having drug-induced psychosis." A sudden crash from the parlor sent both men running back toward the main room. They found Tom on the floor, convulsing violently, while the black mirror above him flickered and pulsed like a television, struggling to find a signal. The surface of the mirror seemed to be moving, rippling like water, and shapes pressed against it from inside: hands, faces, entire bodies pushing against the silvered surface as if it were nothing more than a thin membrane. Tom's convulsions stopped abruptly. When he opened his eyes, they were completely black, reflecting no light at all. When he spoke, his voice was different, deeper, cultured, with an accent that belonged to another century. Finally, the thing wearing Tom's body said, standing with movements that seemed unfamiliar with the young man's limbs, "Do you know how long I have been watching? How long I have been waiting?" The possessed Tom turned to look at Martin and France with those terrible black eyes. "Victor promised us freedom, but he lied. He collected us like butterflies pinned to boards, trapped us in glass and silver for his amusement. But now," the thing smiled with Tom's face, but the expression was wrong, predatory. "Now we have flesh again." Martin and France barricaded themselves in a small storage closet, the only space they could find without any reflective surfaces. Through the thin door, they could hear multiple voices now. Tom's body seemed to be carrying on conversations with itself, different personalities taking turns speaking through his mouth. "The Victorian woman's in there," France whispered, recognizing one of the refined accents bleeding through Tom's vocal cords. "And something older. Medieval, maybe." The voices were discussing strategy, debating which mirrors offered the easiest passage, and which of the remaining humans would be the best vessels. They spoke about Petra and Sarah as if they were livestock, analyzing their mental weaknesses and spiritual vulnerabilities. "The girl with the addiction, her soul, is already fractured," said one voice, "easy to slip inside the cracks." "The older woman's madness makes her permeable," agreed another. "She won't even realize she's sharing her body." Martin pressed his ear to the door, trying to understand their situation. The possessed Tom seemed to be orchestrating something, directing the other trapped souls towards specific mirrors for specific purposes. Suddenly, Petra's voice joined the conversation, but it sounded wrong, layered, as if multiple people were speaking through her throat simultaneously. "The pathways are opening," she said, in a voice that was both hers and not hers. "I can feel them in every piece of glass, every chrome surface, every puddle of water." "Water?" France grabbed Martin's arm with sudden realization. "Reflections work in water too. We're not safe anywhere." As if summoned by his words, Sarah's voice drifted from somewhere in the house, but she was singing a lullaby in a language neither man recognized, her voice harmonizing with itself as if multiple children were singing through her. The first mirror to shatter was the small hand mirror beside Sarah's sleeping bag. The sound rang through the house like a gunshot, followed by Sarah's scream. But the scream was cut short, replaced by the laughter of children who had died decades ago. Martin and France burst from their hiding place to find chaos in the main parlor. Tom's body stood in the center of the room, but he was no longer alone inside it. His movements jerked and twitched as different personalities fought for control of his limbs. Sometimes his right arm moved independently of his left. Sometimes his head turned in directions his body wasn't facing. Petra sat on the floor among the glass shards of the broken hand mirror, cradling pieces of silvered glass that cut her palms. Blood dripped onto the fragments, and with each drop, whispered voices emerged from the broken surface. Sarah stood before the black mirror, her hands pressed against its surface, but now figures were pressing back from inside. The mirror's surface bulged outward like elastic, stretching, but not yet breaking, as dozens of hands pushed against it from within. "We have to get out," Martin said, grabbing France's arm. But the older man was staring at something behind Martin. Martin turned to see his own reflection in a nearby mirror, but the reflection was shaking its head frantically, mouthing the word "no" over and over. When Martin took a step toward the door, his reflection pressed both hands against the glass and screamed silently. Other reflections throughout the room began screaming as well, all the real people's reflections, trapped on the other side, while entities prepared to step through and claim their bodies. The black mirror finally gave way with a sound like reality tearing. The surface didn't shatter, it simply dissolved, leaving empty space where the mirror had hung. Through the opening, Martin could see not the wall behind where the mirror had been, but another room entirely, a Victorian parlor filled with people in period clothing who began stepping through the opening into their reality. 2 days later, Dutch emergency services received 3 separate calls about screaming coming from the boarded house on Lange Haven Street. Police arrived to find the front door standing open and the municipal boarding scattered across the front lawn, as if blown outward by an explosion. Inside, they discovered Tom, Petra, and Sarah catatonic, but alive, sitting motionless among hundreds of shattered mirrors. The 3 were unresponsive to all attempts at communication, their eyes reflecting no recognition of the outside world. Martin and France were never found, though their belongings remained in the house. The only trace of them was discovered in the black mirror's empty frame. 2 palm prints pressed into the wooden backing where the glass had been, as if they had been pushing against the inside of a barrier. At Erasmus Medical Center in Rotterdam, Dr. Elizabeth Voss struggled to understand her 3 new patients. All showed signs of severe psychological trauma, but their blood tests revealed no drugs. Their brain scans showed no injuries, and their physical examinations revealed nothing that could explain their condition. "They're in perfect health," she told the psychiatric team during their morning rounds. "But they don't respond to their names, don't react to pain stimuli, and they haven't blinked in 36 hours. What disturbed Dr. Voss most was their behavior around reflective surfaces. When Tom was moved to a room with a bathroom mirror, he stood before it for hours, pressing his palms against the glass and moving his mouth as if speaking to someone on the other side. But when nurses observed him in the mirror's surface, His reflection didn't match his real movements in the reflection. He appeared to be screaming and pounding frantically on the glass. Petra's case was even more unsettling. She had begun collecting any small reflective objects she could find: spoons, chrome fixtures, her water glass, and arranging them in precise patterns around her bed. When nurses tried to remove them, her vital signs would spike dangerously until the objects were returned. Mayor Elizabeth van der Burg returned to Victor Hendrik's house 3 weeks after the incident, accompanied by Detective Inspector Klaus Vermeer and a consultant from the University of Amsterdam's psychology department. The house stood open and empty, its interior carpeted with glittering shards of broken glass that crunched underfoot like snow. 5 people entered this house, Detective Vermeer said, studying the scene with professional detachment. 3 were found catatonic. 2 disappeared entirely. No signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play, no trace of the missing persons, except. He gestured toward the empty frame where the black mirror had been. Handprints on wood, as if they were pressed against the inside of a barrier. Dr. Amanda Reeves from the University Psychology Department knelt among the glass fragments, collecting samples with tweezers. The patients at Erasmus Medical show classic signs of dissociative disorder, but the onset was simultaneous, and the symptoms are identical. That doesn't match any known psychological condition. Mayor van der Burg found herself drawn to the fragments of a particular mirror, one with an ornate silver frame that had somehow remained intact despite the destruction of its glass. As she stared at the empty frame, she could have sworn she saw movement in the space where the mirror had been, as if something was still reflecting in glass that no longer existed. Victor's journal mentioned 847 souls, she said quietly. His life's work was trapping spirits in mirrors. What if he succeeded? Detective Vermeer gave her a skeptical look. With respect, Mayor, we're looking for rational explanations. Mass hysteria, environmental toxins, shared delusions. Then explain this, Dr. Reeves interrupted. She had been examining the largest pile of mirror fragments and found something that made her voice shake. These glass pieces, they're still reflecting. The others gathered around her. Among the shards lay hundreds of separate pieces of silvered glass, no two connected, yet each piece showed the same reflection. The interior of the house as it existed now, with the 4 of them standing in it. But in the reflection, there were 7 people present, not 4. 6 months after the house was officially condemned, 4 17-year-old students from Rotterdam decided to explore the infamous Mirror House for a school project on local urban legends. Lisa, Marcus, Anya, and David had heard the stories: the disappeared squatters, the hospitalized survivors, the official investigations that produced no answers. "It's just an old house," Marcus said as they approached the building on a drizzly November evening. "The ghost stories are probably just publicity to keep people out." so they can demolish it safely. The house looked different now. Municipal workers had removed the broken glass and boarded up all the windows, but something about the structure itself seemed changed. Where before it had looked merely abandoned, now it appeared hungry, its dark windows like hollow sockets watching their approach. Lisa felt uneasy as they squeezed through a gap in the boarding that other teenagers had created. Maybe this isn't such a good idea, she said, but the others were already inside. The interior was worse than she had expected. Even with all the mirrors removed, the walls showed pale rectangles where they had hung, like ghosts of frames. The house felt wrong in ways she couldn't articulate, too quiet, too cold, filled with an oppressive sense of being watched. "Look at this," Anya called from the main parlor. She had found fragments of mirror that the cleanup crew had missed, tiny pieces wedged into crevices and corners. When she held her phone's flashlight over them, the fragments still reflected, but not the room they were in. The glass shards showed glimpses of the house as it had been when Victor lived there. Fully furnished, mirrors lining every wall, and people moving through the rooms. But these weren't living people. They were figures in period clothing from different eras. Some medieval, some Victorian, some from the early 1900s, all moving with the awkward gaits of those long dead. The four teenagers found themselves trapped in a house that was no longer bound by normal physical laws. Each room led to different versions of itself, sometimes the house as Victor had lived in it, sometimes the house as it existed in different time periods, sometimes rooms that had never existed at all, but were reflected in mirrors that had hung there. Lisa watched in horror as Marcus walked through a doorway and simply vanished. Not walked into another room, vanished completely, as if he had stepped through a hole in reality. His voice could still be heard, calling to them from somewhere that sounded like the same room, but wasn't. "I can see you," Marcus's voice echoed from empty air, "but you look like reflections. Are you real or am I?" Anya tried to follow him through the same doorway, but struck solid wall. The passages only work one way, she realized with growing panic. People can go from our reality into the mirror realm, but not back. David pulled out his smartphone and began filming everything, thinking he could document their experience and figure out what was happening. But when he reviewed the footage on his phone's screen, it showed completely different events than what they had experienced. In the video, they appeared to be standing in rooms full of mirrors, having conversations with people who weren't there. "The phone's recording the mirror reality," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We're already partially crossed over." Lisa found Victor's journal in what remained of his study. Somehow, it had survived all the investigations and cleanup efforts. The final entry, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, provided the explanation they desperately needed. As Lisa read Victor's words aloud about the mirrors being doorways between realities, Anya's reflection in a broken window began moving independently, waving frantically and mouthing warnings they couldn't hear. Then Anya herself began to flicker, sometimes solid, sometimes translucent, sometimes not there at all. Within a year of the teenager's disappearance, the phenomenon had spread beyond Victor's house. Mirrors throughout Schiedam began showing things they shouldn't, glimpses of other times, other places, other people. Shop windows reflected not the current street scene, but historical versions of the same locations. Bathroom mirrors in homes near the house showed rooms that didn't match the houses they were in. Dr. Elizabeth Voss, the psychiatrist treating the original 3 survivors, had documented 17 new cases of people experiencing mirror displacement syndrome, her term for the condition, where patients insisted their reflections were moving independently and showing them images from impossible realities. All 17 cases lived within a 3-kilometer radius of Victor's house. "It's spreading like a contagion," she reported to the Rotterdam health authorities, though her reports were filed away and forgotten. But it's not a virus or bacteria. It's more like a breakdown in the fundamental nature of reflection itself. Mayor van der Berg had the house demolished 6 months after the teenagers vanished. But the demolition crew reported strange occurrences during the work. Mirrors in their own homes began showing the house still standing, still filled with its impossible collection of reflective surfaces. The empty lot where the house had stood developed an unusual property. Any reflective surface brought onto the property would show not the current empty lot, but the house as it had appeared at various points in its history. Puddles of rainwater showed Victor's collection in its full glory. Chrome bumpers of parked cars reflected rooms full of mirrors stretching into infinity. Local authorities cordoned off the lot, but curious visitors continued to arrive. Some left normal security camera footage showing an empty lot. Others left recordings that showed a house full of mirrors and people. And when those people looked closely at the footage, they could see themselves standing among the crowd of spirits, even though they had never entered any building. 2 years after the house's demolition, Schiedam had become a city living in 2 realities simultaneously. Half the population claimed to see the normal, modern city in their mirrors and windows. The other half saw a growing network of Victorian-era buildings connected by impossible geometries, populated by people from across centuries. Emma, the university student who had first researched Victor's collection, returned to the city as a doctoral candidate, studying localized reality distortion phenomena. Her academic advisor had reluctantly approved her research proposal only because similar cases were being reported in cities across Europe, always centered around locations where large collections of antique mirrors had been housed. She set up equipment in a hotel room 3 blocks from where Victor's house had stood, using an array of cameras, audio recorders, and electromagnetic sensors to document the phenomenon. What she discovered challenged every assumption about the nature of reality itself. Her cameras, when pointed at mirrors, recorded two different sets of images simultaneously. Standard cameras showed normal reflections of her hotel room, but cameras with silvered components, lenses with silver-backed coatings, mirrors with silver backings, recorded something entirely different. These cameras showed her hotel room as part of a vast network of connected spaces that extended far beyond the physical building. Through the mirrors in her room, she could see corridors stretching for kilometers, lined with doors that opened onto rooms from different time periods, different continents, different versions of reality itself. On her 7th night in the hotel, Victor appeared directly in the mirror of her room, not reflected from somewhere else, but present in the mirror as if it were a window, speaking directly to her. "You understand now," he said, his voice coming not from the mirror, but from inside her own head. The mirrors were never about trapping souls. They were about creating new spaces for souls to inhabit, new realities where death is just another doorway. Emma realized she could no longer remember which side of the mirror she was actually on.